Okay, so the story I want to tell you today is the about the first trip that I took to Afghanistan in 1992. And at that time, I was living in India, in New Delhi, and I had the opportunity to travel to Kabul with a friend who I met up in New Delhi, who I didn't expect to see there. I had met him several years earlier in the United States, and he was working in Afghanistan for a an NGO, a relief organization that provided health care and assistance to the Afghan people. And so when I met him in New Delhi, I asked him if there was an opportunity for me to go back to Afghanistan with him to make a trip and meet some of the folks that he was working with. And a couple of weeks earlier, this opportunity would not have come to me because it was a communist government. It was very difficult to go into Afghanistan at that time. But within a week or two, the Mujahedeen had conquered the communist government and finally took over the city of Kabul 2 or 3 weeks previously to me meeting up with my friend. And so I was able to fly into Kabul in March of 1992. And about a week or a few days before that, the president of Afghanistan was landing in the city of Kabul in his plane, and a rocket hit the plane and knocked out the nose of the plane, but the plane was able to safely land at the airport, and the president was okay. And I remember landing in Kabul and seeing destroyed aircraft on the sides of the runway because of the years of war and the intense warfare that had taken place with the Mujahideen takeover of Kabul. And I remember seeing the president's plane. It was there. It was perfectly intact plane, but the nose was blown off the plane. And so we landed. When we got to the air, when we got off the plane, we got into a Land Cruiser, and there were six of us that got in. We tied our luggage on the top of the vehicle and made our way out of the airport. Now, my friend was driving, and he was on my left, and I was sitting in the middle of the vehicle, the front seat, and then the guy who drove the vehicle to the airport was sitting on my right, and then the three people in the back seat. And we left the airport and we drove through the city of Kabul. I remember stopping at many checkpoints throughout the city, manned by Mujahideen warriors. And they were checking the vehicle, seeing who we were, and letting us continue on through the city. And finally, we got close to the neighborhood that was our destination. We turned off the main road and into this neighborhood. And when we turned the vehicle, we were startled because we startled a group of mujahideen that had embedded themselves behind some sandbags and dug themselves into the ground to protect the neighborhood. And when our vehicle turned the corner, they were startled and they stood up and pointed their weapons at us. And one guy had a rocket-propelled grenade, and he was pointing it right at our vehicle and seemingly right at me because I was sitting front and center. And immediately, the driver and the passenger to my right jumped out of the vehicle, and they said to the Mujahideen, "Hey, it's us. Everything's okay." And immediately, the Mujahideen recognized them, put their weapons down, and or lowered their weapons, and said, "Hey, okay, you guys really scared us, and I'm glad nothing happened. So, so there's no problem." So they got back in the vehicle, and we proceeded to go to the house we were going to. And so there's a couple of takeaways from this story. One is that my experience driving through the streets of Kabul at that time, I think, is probably a good picture of what Afghanistan is going to look like as of today. The U.S. government has officially left Kabul. The Taliban have taken over the airport, and the country is in the hands of the Taliban. And what I experienced in driving through the city on my first trip to Afghanistan was a microcosm of what the entire country was like. And I had the opportunities in the years after that first trip to travel through many locations in Afghanistan, the north and the East. And there were different areas of the country that were controlled by different mujahedeen groups and checkposts along the roads. And that was normal for life. It was a time of war. There was no U.S. embassy functioning in the country. It had not functioned for years. And it was a war zone. And Afghanistan is getting back to that again. And the Taliban certainly will be in control of the city of Kabul. I don't know if they're going to be able to control every neighborhood. Maybe they do, and maybe they will. But they're not going to control the entire country unless they form a coalition with these other ethnic groups. And I don't know if that's going to happen. And I'm going to predict that the other ethnic groups are not going to go along with the Taliban, and that we're getting back to Afghanistan is getting back to what it was in 1992. So that's my takeaway relating my first trip to Afghanistan and my experiences traveling in the country to what I think Afghanistan is today. And there's been a lot of progress in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, a lot of development, I should say, of the infrastructure. And when I look at videos and pictures of the city of Kabul and the paved roads and the buildings, it's a very different city than Kabul was when I visited there and lived in Afghanistan. And so that's my first takeaway, that we're back to, unfortunately, just a fragmented country ethnically, and probably there's going to be a lot of fighting in the years to come. The second takeaway is the amazing people that have lived in Afghanistan as foreigners. Christian groups and others, but really mostly Christian groups that have lived in the country, and from many different nations of the world. And they have helped the people of Afghanistan. They've been there, not the same people, but people like this have been and lived in the country for, I'd say, the last 50 to 70 years, in good times and very difficult times. And that's the amazing thing about the folks that are committed to assisting and in delivering relief and medical care in one of the poorest countries of the world, with one of the highest illiteracy rates in the world and one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. And Afghanistan's always been a country in great need. At different times in the last 70 years, there have been times of great development and infrastructure and education and lifestyle that is less traditional, but things are changing and have changed in Afghanistan and will be different. But under the radar screen, or not really under the radar screen, but really not very well publicized, there's always been fantastic people that have lived in Afghanistan and devoted themselves to just showing love to the people of Afghanistan. These are some of the greatest people that I've ever met in my life, and some of them are no longer with us. And I'm going to be telling you some of my experiences with a couple of the guys that I knew in Afghanistan who lost their lives, and just great people, and they have impacted my life, and I never will forget about them. And one of those was a guy that was that took me into Kabul on my first trip, and I'm going to tell some of his stories, and you're going to know a little bit about him. Part of his story is very public and is found on the internet, and I'll do my best to tell a little bit about him and some other people that I knew in Afghanistan. But there's many people there today, and I've known many people over the years that have served with great dedication, whether the U.S. military is there or not, and whatever's going on in Afghanistan. There's always been fantastic people that are doing incredible things to help people in great need. So that's my other takeaway. Afghanistan is a country that it's sad what has happened, but there's some great people working in Afghanistan, and in the years to come, future generations, there's going to be many stories of people positively impacted by the work of good people in Afghanistan. So that's my story for today. Thanks for listening. please add in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. If you want to share anything that you know, please do that. If you have any questions, be glad to answer any questions.